All right. And we will get started with tonight's presentation, The Beginnings of Libertyville, the First 100 Years and Then Some. I am going to go ahead and turn off my video so that you're not having to stare at my face and can look at these slides instead. So we thought that with the 250, it would be a good time to not only look back at our nation's history through lots of events that have been going on, but to also look back at our community's history. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at early settlement in Lake County along the Des Plaines River, and also Libertyville's first 100 years or so. So take a look at this map from 1814. It features the region appended to the United States in 1787, known as the Northwest Territory, which then encompassed the country's western frontier. At the time this was published, only Ohio had been incorporated as a state. The other areas were organized into Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan territories. I'm asking you, did you notice anything odd about it? Perhaps where the northern boundary of Illinois is? Here I've zoomed in a bit. This map shows the Chicago region. Chicago is circled in red as part of the territory which would become Wisconsin. The original state boundary was going to be at the southern tip of Lake Michigan. As Illinois prepared for statehood in 1818, the question of power distribution among the northern states and the slave-holding southern states was a contentious issue. Nathaniel Pope, the delegate to Congress from Illinois Territory, successfully argued that the Illinois border should be pushed much further north to include Chicago, because this would further connect the new state with northern non-slaveholding interests. And this was just before the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Congress approved the statehood bill, which moved the border about 41 miles north. At the time, there weren't a lot of potential voters north that could object. When Illinois statehood became official in 1818, the bulk of the non-native population was in the southern portion. The main migration highway for these new settlers was the Ohio River. Northeast Illinois was the last part of the state to be settled, being both far from the Ohio River and heavily wooded and marshy in portions. Since the mid-1700s, it was largely the Potawatomi people who called this region home after a series of migrations from the east and north. Although trading posts have been scattered throughout the area since 1695, no true non-native settlement would emerge until after 1833. That was the year of the Treaty of Chicago, one of many documents ceding land to the new U.S. government and forcing resettlement or removal of native peoples like the Potawatomi further to the west. Between 1795 and 1837, the Potawatomi had made 38 treaties with the U.S., 34 involving land surrenders. Under the Treaty of Chicago, they had until 1836 to vacate the area and relocate to today's Iowa, Missouri, or Kansas. Throughout the next 2 decades, 3 developments in transportation facilitated this area's growth, especially the Illinois-Michigan Canal and the railroad. Throughout the young American nation, the 1820s to 1840s were the era of canal building. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 made it easier to get to the Great Lakes from New England and New York. It also became much easier to transport Western agricultural products back east. Closer to home, the 90-mile Illinois and Michigan Canal was dug between the Chicago River and the Illinois River and ultimately connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River and thus the Gulf of Mexico. Construction began in 1836 and continued until it was finally finished in 1848. There were several construction delays because the company and the state were constantly strapped for cash. Canal made Chicago even more important as a center for commerce and facilitated its growth. But its importance for northern Illinois was that it brought lots of workers to the area. The focus on canal building underscores the fact that in the 1830s, travel by water was the way to go. Settlers came to Lake County via 3 main routes from Chicago, along the shore of Lake Michigan, the Des Plaines River, and the North Branch of the Chicago River, also known as the Skokie. In 1673, Father Jacques Marquette referred to the Des Plaines River as the River of Portage, and wrote of its tendency to flood its banks. This seems to be how the river got its name, as an 18th century cartographer named it Plein, P-L-E-I-N, for its high water. The French eau pleine, meaning full of water, evolved into eau plaine and finally des Plaines. The Skokie, conversely, is named for the Potawatomi word for marsh or swamp. As the names indicate, in this period, the Des Plaines was somewhat more navigable than the Skokie, and it formed more of a transportation corridor for the earliest settlers. And although the land in this area would not be officially surveyed until 1840 and not for sale until 1842 in Libertyville Township, that didn't stop some hardy souls from making their way west and north to make claims. And as they moved into the area, the Des Plaines River was a natural path to follow. Any settler that had a claim, established a residence, and improved the land could file a right of preemption, which allowed him to purchase up to 160 acres at $1.25 an acre, where the improvements were located, free from competition when the land went up for sale. Why was the Des Plaines River better than land along Lake Michigan? Well, the land farther inland from Lake Michigan was more suitable for farming, and much of the shoreline consisted of forest or uneven terrain like ravines. This 1829 map of the boundary line between ceded and unceded lands shows an early Indian trading route marked Trace to Milwaukee and Green Bay. Settlers arriving in Chicago could follow this trail northwest up on the high land above the Des Plaines River. This trail would later be established as the Milwaukee Road, known today with a few minor changes as Milwaukee Avenue. This map was drawn by a member of the Libertyville Historical Society in the 1970s. It shows the trajectory of settlement along the Des Plaines River in Vernon and Libertyville townships, from about today's Aptekissick Road up to Route 137. This was the first main corridor of settlement in Lake County in the mid-1830s, and I'll highlight just a few of the early arrivals. Daniel Wright is considered Lake County's first permanent non-native settler, and he came in 1833. He was born in Vermont. He was a farmer and a veteran of the War of 1812. He moved to Ohio in 1814, and in 1832, he began to explore land in Illinois. Rumors of good, cheap farmland led Wright to Fort Dearborn, where trappers told him of good hunting along the Des Plaines River near what would become Half Day and later Lincolnshire. Wright was the first of the newcomers to stay year-round in what would later become Lake County. He built a cabin on the west side of the river at about the spot today's Aptekissick Road would intersect with the Des Plaines if it continued east through the Par King mini golf parking lot, close to the Ryerson Woods Preserve. Wright sent for his wife, who came from Ohio with 7 children, 2 oxen, and 1 cow. The first few years were not at all easy. Prairie fires destroyed winter hay. 2 of his sons died, as did his wife. When Wright arrived, the landscape would have been similar to what is seen on this 1840 Federal Township plat map, which shows Vernon Township near the intersection of the Des Plaines River and Indian Creek. Note the mostly prairie on the west side of the river and the timber on the east. A few houses and a barn are already in place when the land was surveyed. You can see those circled in red. In a letter published in the Waukegan Gazette in 1868, the nearly 90-year-old Wright wrote of his early days in the area. He said, "At this time, how picturesque the landscape around, not like the eastern grandeur of towering hills and winding valleys, but a boundless sea of nature's growth. And when summer put on her finest tints, the wide-spreading prairies rolled their waves of blossoms to the breeze, reminding the observer that this was nature's garden. Then summer doffed her pleasing robes, and the chill frost nipped life of the vegetation till all was ready for combustion. Then came the crackling flames," he's referencing the prairie fires, "and woe be unto the house that had not a belt of plowed land around it. Then came the winter, when the cheerless and dreary expanse was raked by piercing winds. There were then no roads but an Indian trail, no neighbors to make a friendly call or to help in case of distress or want." Sounds like a pretty tough life to me. Moving a little farther north to about where the Cuneo Mansion is today, we find the claim of brothers Ransom and Richard Steele. Ransom Steele was born in Waterbury, Connecticut in 1798. He was engaged in the woolen manufacturing business before deciding to seek a home in the far west and become a farmer. He set out for Illinois in 1834 to join his brother Richard, who had come out the year before. They stayed near Naperville for a few months before heading northeast and making claims on land 2.5 miles south of today's Libertyville. Ransom's wife, Betsy, daughter Margaret, and son Homer, accompanied by brother-in-law Davis C. Steele, joined Ransom in the fall of 1835. Davis Steele would go on to own Libertyville's Grove Hotel, which we'll see later in this presentation. Another family, Henry B. Steele, served as sheriff of McHenry County and Lake County and was Libertyville's first postmaster. I've included Charles Bartlett in this presentation because of the wonderful description of his journey from New England to Lake County in his profile in the Portrait and Biographical Album of Lake County, which I feel really illustrates the efforts made by these pioneers. Charles Bartlett was born in 1804 and grew up on a farm in New Hampshire. When he turned 21, he began work as a stonemason in Nassau, New York. He engaged in several trades over the next few years before deciding to move west. And on his journey, which I've tried to kind of outline with a red line here, give you a sense of his travels. He first traveled by stage to Albany, New York, then by train to Schenectady, where he took a boat on the Erie Canal to Buffalo. From Buffalo, Charles took a steamer to Detroit, and then a stage across Michigan to St. Joseph. On September 13th, 1834, Charles and 5 companions started on foot for Chicago, arriving October 1st, a journey of about 2.5 weeks and nearly 100 miles on today's Google Maps. I mapped the entire trip on Google Maps, and following the highways, it's over 800 miles. Although he had married Sally Pearson in 1831 and had 2 children, it did not appear that the family was on the journey with him. He was one of the first county commissioners of McHenry County, and he once again served as a county commissioner when Lake County was formed in 1839. He moved away for a time but returned in 1846 and had a big property on the west side of Diamond Lake. He was instrumental in the organization of school districts and roads and churches. And a side note, the man who purchased Charles Bartlett's Libertyville claim was John Locke, who would become Libertyville's first mayor when the village incorporated in 1882. While these men had claims, near what would become the town of Libertyville, our origin story generally begins with George Varden. As the story goes, much of the land on the west side of the Des Plaines River was open prairie. Right at the present site of Libertyville, there was a grove of oak trees running back to what is now Butler Lake. An Englishman named George Varden settled in this grove in 1835, right where Cook Park in downtown Libertyville is today. Little is known about George Varden, other than he was a man of culture and had a wife and daughter. The Vardens had moved on within the year, but the area was initially known as Varden's Grove after this first family. In June of 1836, a stagecoach line was established along the New Milwaukee Road, connecting Chicago to Milwaukee. The newly established road cut through the fledgling community of Varden's Grove and helped to secure its future as an established town. The story continues that a month later, on July 4th, 1836, the early settlers of Varden's Grove erected a flagpole in a small clearing and dubbed the community Independence Grove. But when the town applied for a post office, it chose the name Libertyville. Henry Steele, who had taken up residence in the former Varden cabin, was appointed the first postmaster in 1838. And of course, the name Independence Grove is preserved in our nearby forest preserve today. During those early years, others found their way to the settlement. New arrivals to the area in 1836 and 1837 included Dr. William Crane, Horace Butler, and Dr. Jesse Haven Foster. Dr. Crane came from Vermont in 1836 and took up a tract of land along the Milwaukee Road near today's Libertyville Bank and Trust and northward to Lake Street. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, and although a physician, he did not practice in this area. Instead, he opened the first hotel or tavern in the village and had business interests and a saw and grist mill in town. After township government was adopted in 1850, he was elected as the first supervisor. Horace Butler came from New Hampshire in 1837. He was a lawyer and very active in public affairs. He served as a postmaster, justice of the peace, and probate justice, and today's Butler Lake bears his name as it sat on the west side of his property. Dr. Jesse Haven Foster came from Vermont in 1837 and was the first practicing physician in the area. He purchased the Grove, about 18.5 acres along the Milwaukee Road, the location originally settled by George Varden. Many years later, Dr. Foster would sell the property to his son-in-law, Ansel B. Cook, who would build the house which sits in Libertyville's heart today. In December 1836, a meeting of inhabitants on the Upper Des Plaines River took place at Independence Grove. These early settlers set up a compact amongst themselves to define their rights and security, since, as mentioned, the government had not officially opened the land for settlement and was thus not of much use. The compact mainly focused on keeping track of claims, protecting claims against intruders, and preventing excessive speculation. Given this precedent, it makes sense that when Lake County was established in 1839, portioned off from McHenry County, Libertyville was chosen as the county seat. It seemed central, and the Milwaukee Road at this point was a primary route through the county. At that time, the town's name was changed again to Burlington for reasons unknown. However, there was another claimant to the county seat crown, Little Fort, on the coast of Lake Michigan. French maps show a trading post at Little Fort in the early 18th century, though no permanent settlement was maintained dating to that time. However, the spot had good prospects, a natural harbor with high and dry bluff land above, as well as farmland to the west. Quickly, it filled the need for a market center that was less distant than Chicago, with access to Lake Michigan, the principal avenue for commercial trade, a necessity considering that in the 1840s, the journey to Chicago with horses pulling a full load could take a few days, depending on the weather and road conditions. Between 1844 and 1848, over 1,800 steamboats and other lake craft arrived in Little Fort, bringing salt, machinery, furniture, and other supplies. They departed with the area's production of wheat, oats, corn, barley, beans, and wool. To fuel steamboats, over 3,000 cords of wood left annually. When the town incorporated in 1849, the Little Fort name was dropped because it was thought the adjective little was discouraging to investment capital. Chosen in its place was Waukegan, which meant trading post in the Potawatomi language. In 1841, the increasing population and potential for development along the lakefront created demand among some county residents to relocate the county seat from Libertyville's Burlington to Little Fort. At a countywide vote held in April, Little Fort was selected by a margin of 188. Libertyville Burlington residents who had assumed victory alleged shenanigans, given that there seemed to have been more votes cast than the number of potential voters residing in the county. Regardless, the county seat was moved to Little Fort, and our town reverted back to the name Libertyville. These two maps, the Federal Township Plat Map from 1840 and the first comprehensive map drawn of Lake County in 1861, show the development of the region where Libertyville is today over 2 decades of pioneer settlement. In the 1840 census, Lake County's population was about 2,600. In 1850, 14,000. In 1860, 18,000. And by 1880, about 21,000. Many of those new inhabitants came from other countries like Ireland or Scotland or Germany. Others came from the eastern states. Development in Libertyville from 1840 to 1880 was slow but steady. During these decades, Lake County remained essentially a county of rural farming communities, and Libertyville was no exception. Census data indicates that the estimated population of Libertyville grew from around 67 residents in 1840 to 221 in 1880. Other local histories give higher population numbers for this period. In his 1854 History of Lake County, Elijah Haynes states that at the time of his writing, the village contains at the present time some 300 or 400 inhabitants, 2 or 3 stores, a large commodious hotel, a steam flouring mill and sawmill, and above all, 2 fine churches. Early buildings in the town included the Grove House Hotel, seen here on the left, which was on the main street. It opened in the 1840s and is pictured here in the 1860s. This was located where the Proctor Building, also known as the Newcastle Hotel Building, is today. In 1868, the Union Church was constructed on the south side of West Church Street for use by the town's Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Universalist congregations. This is the current site of St. Lawrence Church. Big change happened in Libertyville during this one decade, the 1880 to 1890, but we need to go back a little bit to lay the path, or should I say tracks. The year 1848 is seen as a transformative one in Chicago history. Political unrest in Germany and the potato famine in Ireland were triggering waves of immigration. Cyrus McCormick relocated his reaper manufacturing business from Virginia to Chicago. A new telegraph line connected Chicago and Milwaukee. The Illinois and Michigan Canal was completed, placing Chicago at the fulcrum of a major water transportation corridor. However, it was also the year that marked the beginning of something that would make the canal, if not obsolete, much less essential. In 1848, the first railroad tracks out of Chicago, the Galena and Chicago Union Line, were laid. Many more rail lines were to follow, with Chicago becoming the railroad capital of the United States. In 1851, the state of Illinois granted a charter to a company to construct the railroad from Chicago to the Wisconsin state line by way of Waukegan. The company commenced the work of building the rail line in 1853. The new railroad was routed east of the Des Plaines River, in part because there was so much timber, especially pine. The company was able to secure the rail ties right on the spot, employing local men to cut them. In 1855, the first train ran through Lake County from Chicago. The train left Chicago at 9:30 a.m. and ran the 35 miles to Waukegan in 3 hours. The speed of nearly 12 miles per hour was believed to be close to a world record at the time. Such ease of access to Chicago brought additional people to the region, in turn changing the demographics of the county. The railroad transformed the landscape in other ways as well. Prior to the railroad, there were few east-west roads in the county. If farmers wanted to go east-west, they had to traipse across open fields or through forest. The arrival of the railroad ensured that the creation of east-west roads because farmers needed access to trains for their produce and livestock for market. The first station in the area was at Rockland in what is now Lake Bluff. With increasing traffic, Rockland Road, now part of 176, was graded to Libertyville in 1856. While the Des Plaines River and other waterways served as guides for early settlers, it would be the crossing of the river by the railroad that would lead to significant growth in Libertyville. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad ran a line from Chicago to Milwaukee about 1872, but on the east side of the Des Plaines River. The closest stop to the village was Libertyville Junction, known today as Rondout. By 1879, Libertyville had grown to the point where both businessmen and farmers could see the benefit of a railroad in their community. Colonel E.B. Messer, George Skank, and Dr. Sam Galloway worked out a deal with the railroad company. The railroad promised to lay tracks into Libertyville and provide one daily trip to Chicago. Libertyville's side of the bargain was a little more work. They had to acquire the right-of-way for the tracks to come into town, grade the roadbed, build a bridge across the Des Plaines River, and provide the land for the depot. But Libertyville got to it, and on May 31st, 1880, the first train whistle sounded in town. The frequency of trains increased, and passenger cars were added to the line. Within a few years, Henry Kern built a boarding house on the southwest corner of First and Church Streets, and the Wright brothers started a lumber yard and mill right near the depot. So when the first train station, this is First, going this way, and Cook Avenue approximately right here. The original tracks ran behind the Folds factory and ended up at First Street between Cook and Church Streets. The Folds factory was not there at the time, but that's where the tracks ended up. As expected, the coming of the railroad to Libertyville ushered in a building boom. The years between 1880 and 1882, quote, saw the building of 2 grain elevators, a hotel and livery stable, 2 lumber yards, some half-dozen store buildings, 2 churches, and about 25 new homes, as well as doubling the population from 221 to 550 people during the decade. Encouraged by the increased development, local leaders petitioned Judge Francis E. Clark in Waukegan for the right to hold a referendum on incorporation. The referendum was held in April 1882, and a strong majority of Libertyville citizens voted to incorporate as a village. The first officers were elected a month later, and John Locke, who I mentioned earlier, a New Hampshire-born farmer with holdings south of the village, was elected as Libertyville's first mayor. Downtown development continued at an increased pace through the 1890s. In need of additional space, Libertyville Township government constructed a new town hall in 1894. Today, the building is the American Legion Hall. The Lake County Bank, the first bank in the village, which was established in 1892, built a new building on the northwest corner of Cook and Milwaukee Avenues in 1894. That is seen here in the bottom right. That is now home to the picnic basket. The presence of the railroad continued to encourage industrial development. Frederick Grabby was the first citizen to exploit the spring waters of the village, starting a bottling concern sometime in the 1880s. The Urbana spring water was the favorite of little people Commodore Foote and the Fairy Queen, who visited Libertyville often, and there was great demand for the water throughout the North Shore. Several buildings were erected by local speculators in the 1890s to attract manufacturers to the area. And by the end of the decade, there was a proliferation of small industries on Sprague, which is now Cook, and Orchard, which is now Church Avenue, including the F.E. Hanley and Company factory, which produced butter and cheese, the lumber yard, the Chicago Metal Stamping Company, and several others, including an agricultural implements manufacturer, ice house, and stockyard. In 1898, the Earl Ladder Company moved from Michigan to Libertyville to occupy a 3-story brick building on the north side of Church Street, east of the downtown core. The building later housed the Falls Macaroni Company. That building is still standing today, although the company went out of business several years ago. Through this late 19th century boom, the village of Libertyville also established new structures and spaces that supported the civic and social lives of its residents. As the population grew, so did the local congregations. Both the Methodist and Presbyterian churches moved out of the shared Union Church and built their own structures. In the upper left, we have the Presbyterian Church, built in 1881 on the north side of East Church Street, across from Wright Court. On the upper right, we have the 1892 Methodist Church on Milwaukee Avenue, which is now where the Joyful Gourmet building is. In the bottom left, we have the school that was built in 1886 on School Street. It was expanded in 1906 to accommodate the growing population. We'll see its replacement a little later in this presentation. And in 1886, St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church built a church at the corner of First and Newberry. The night of August 30th to 31st, 1895 was a defining date in the history of Libertyville. Cigar maker Max LeBeau, whose store was in the current Picnic Mass building, was up late working to finish cigar orders around midnight. To rest his eyes for a few minutes, Max rose from his chair, walked to the front of his shop, and looked out the window. And he saw huge flames leaping skyward in back of Skank's hardware store, which is seen here, before the fire, on the corner of Milwaukee and Sprague, which is now Milwaukee and Cook, the location of where Roland's Jewelers is today. He called out fire, rousing many people from their sleep. Bucket brigades quickly formed because there was no fire department. But despite the efforts of the people carrying the buckets, and primarily because of a lack of readily available water, fighting the fire proved a tough battle. Here we're looking to the west, about the corner of Cook and Milwaukee. Buildings on the west side of Milwaukee were untouched by the fire, but on the east side, 27 frame buildings were completely destroyed. The cause was never determined, but there was no mention of a cow kicking over a lantern. This is another view looking to the southwest. Where all the trees are is the property of Mr. Cook. The steeple in the back is the Union Church that we mentioned before. And the building that's standing across the street is the current Picnic Basket. If you look closely, you can see the name Max LeBeau above the right-hand window. Only 2 days after the fire, the village board passed a law requiring that new buildings be made of brick. Another law set safety requirements for chimneys and other fire prevention measures were adopted. In November, 52 residents appeared before the village board to demand better fire protection. Soon a volunteer fire brigade was organized and a manually operated fire engine was purchased. But Libertyville was not down and out, and in fact, a 1903 newspaper article said, Libertyville's remarkable growth from the last few years is mainly the result of the Great Fire of 1895, which wiped out the entire business section. Since then, the grit and energy of its businessmen have materialized into what might be termed a united effort to build a new and ideal city on the ashes of the old town. Within the next couple of years, established businesses rebuilt, while new investors constructed modern business blocks where the old wooden buildings once stood. And other buildings sprung up on land not even touched by the fire, such as the Libertyville Hotel in the bottom corner. So in the upper left, we have the corner of Milwaukee and Cook. The building on the corner now hosts Maison Chic. To the right, we are looking north on Milwaukee Avenue at the east side. We have the Skank Brothers building, now home to Roland Jewelers. You can still see the steeple of the Methodist Church there. The Methodist Church was saved from the fire by them dynamiting a building ahead of that. And then the bottom left, the Libertyville Hotel on the corner of Church and Milwaukee, which is today's Contra's Cup. While the population and building boom in the late 19th century in Libertyville established the village as a commercial and industrial center with a rural farming community, the early decades of the 20th century witnessed its evolution into a suburban hub and a location for several country estates owned by prominent Chicagoans. This movement began with the construction of the Madison Spur of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway, which opened to the north end of the village in 1900, but the station was on the east side of the street, not the west where it is today. The spur allowed for regular commuter service to the village for the first time, encouraging city dwellers to settle in and around town. Access was further improved when the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railroad built a spur from Lake Bluff to Libertyville in 1903. The electric line ran at the southern end of the village, crossing east to west south of Park Avenue. Today it is the North Shore Bike Trail. We're looking at the depot here in the bottom right. That is where the empty parking lot next to the Libertyville Animal Hospital is today. Newspaper advertisements encouraged men who dreamed of the country life and becoming gentleman farmers to move to the area. One of my favorites is where it talks about if you have the farm fever. That sounds dangerous. I will briefly tell you about two of these men. In 1902, John R. Thompson purchased a large tract of land south of downtown Libertyville from the Stratton family, who had owned the land since 1843. Architect Benjamin Marshall designed the impressive Colonial Revival house a few years later. In 1909, Thompson added a sunken garden with a lily pond, and the local paper ran a column that said, "The Thompson farm is one of the prettiest spots near Libertyville. The buildings and fences are all white and located on high ground and can be seen for miles around. The view from top of the knoll at the farm presents an expanse of broad acres, which is the finest farming land to be found in northern Illinois." Thompson moved to Lake Forest in the summer of 1922. Samuel Insull purchased the Libertyville farm in 1923 as a wedding present for his son, Samuel Insull Jr. And it was Insull Jr. that installed the red roofing material that would earn the farm's name, Red Top Farm. Another of those men with farm fever was public utilities magnate and former partner of Thomas Edison, Samuel Insull. He purchased the 160-acre Barr Farm south of the village limits in 1907. He moved his family into the existing farmhouse on the property the next year. And in 1914, he commissioned architect Benjamin Marshall to design a Renaissance Revival mansion to replace the original farmhouse. Today, that house is known as the Cuneo House. Over the next 20 years, Insull extended his holdings around the farm, ultimately acquiring thousands of acres. If you'd like to know more about Thompson and Insull and some other gentleman farmers of the area, I refer you to the Libertyville Historical Society's YouTube channel. We did a presentation on Libertyville and Lake Forest gentleman farmers a couple of years ago, and the full recording is on the YouTube channel. In town, improvements to the village's infrastructure occurred during the first decade of the 20th century, including the creation of a local franchise of the North Shore Gas Company and the establishment of water and sewer systems around the same time in that first decade. Electrical service and telephone service have been established in the late 1890s. Commercial development within the village of Libertyville also expanded rapidly in the first 20 years of the century. From 1900 to 1910, 11 buildings were constructed within the central business district, 9 along Milwaukee Avenue and 2 on Cook. An additional 3 buildings were erected between 1910 and 1920. One of the most important commercial buildings erected during that first decade was the Proctor Block, seen here. The building was financed by brothers Robert Charles and Richard Proctor and their cousin Elisha, and designed by Chicago architect William Craig. The 2-story brick building housed commercial storefronts on the first story, while much of the second floor was taken up by rooms for the Newcastle Hotel, the largest of 3 operating hotels in Libertyville at that time. When the building was completed in 1903, the block was lauded as Libertyville's first metropolitan building, the pride of all citizens. Towns 5 times the size of Libertyville cannot boast of buildings similar to the Proctor Block, and it can be said that such a building as the Proctor Block is just the kind of building Libertyville requires. To the north of the Proctor Block, the First National Bank building replaced the Methodist Church at the southeast corner of Milwaukee Avenue and School Street. In 1912, the Methodist Church began construction on a new brick church building on Brainerd Avenue, where it's located today, to accommodate its growing congregation. And the First National Bank purchased the property, tore the frame church down, and built a new 3-story brick building on the lot. The bank remained on the first floor of that building until it merged with the Lake County National Bank in 1932. As the population grew, so did the town's social institutions. Again, after a fire destroyed St. Peter and Paul Church in 1904, St. Joseph's Church was built in 1905 on Maple Avenue. And a school was added in 1926. The school will be celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. That's in the upper left-hand corner. In the upper right-hand corner is the First Methodist Church, built in 1913, on its current site at Church Street and Brainerd Avenue. And at the bottom, high school classes have met at the Central School since 1898. A separate high school district formed in 1916. The school building opened for classes in September of 1917, and Jackson Gym was added in 1929. The new train lines also brought an increased number of visitors to Libertyville as an entertainment destination in the early 20th century. Chicago Walking and St. Paul Railway Depot on the north side of town brought visitors within walking distance of the Lake County Fairgrounds, which was located on the site of today's Lake Manier from 1882 to 1925. The Electric Railroad offered a stop within walking distance of the 1-mile track. The heart of the track was located at the intersection of today's Crane, Carter, and Rockland roads, and opened in 1904 as a harness racing venue. A few automobile and motorcycle races were held there in its later years. The track's heyday ended by the middle of the 19-teens, and it was demolished in 1918. After World War I, Libertyville was caught up in the trend of suburbanization. From 1920 to 1930, farmland around the perimeter of the village center was purchased for development, and numerous subdivisions were platted during this time. The North Shore Electric Line opened a second line through Libertyville, the Skokie Valley Line, which made it even easier and faster to get to and from town. Many streets were paved throughout the village for the first time, and parking lines were drawn. Several commercial buildings were constructed during the decade. At the bottom, the Lake County National Bank was completed in 1923 on the west side of Milwaukee Avenue between Cook Avenue and Church Street, School Street. In the upper left, in 1929, Benjamin L. Dahl constructed a new 1-story commercial block at the northwest corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Lake Street. But perhaps the most impressive new building built that decade is in the upper right, the Public Service Company building. It was built in 1928 and housed Samuel Insull's Public Service Company, as well as the Libertyville Trust and Savings Bank. Additional retail spaces occupied the ground floor of the building, and the second floor contained office space, as well as 7 kitchenette apartments. The 1920s boom was also reflected in the construction of a new school and a hospital. Rockland School started construction in 1926 and welcomed students in January 1927, so they are also quickly approaching their 100th anniversary. Condell Memorial Hospital was built in 1928 with funds from the estate of Elizabeth Condell, who wished to build the hospital in memory of her parents. When it opened, the hospital had 25 beds. Funding for the construction of the hospital was truly a community affair, as Miss Condell stipulated that the citizens of Libertyville must raise $5,000 before the hospital could be built. Community members from utilities, magnates, Samuel Insull to housewives contributed to the project in order to build a hospital on the prairie. And of course, I have to say that the most important institutional addition to the village in this time period was the conversion of the Answer Cook home and grounds into a public library and park. In accordance with the wishes of her husband, Cook's widow, Emily Barrows Cook, left the house and gardens to the village of Libertyville after her death in December of 1919. The Ansel B. and Emily Barrows Cook Memorial Library opened in 1921 after fundraising and a few architectural changes made to make the house look more like a civic building. Growth slowed in the 1930s, but a few buildings that are still with us today were built during that decade. One of these was the Liberty Theater in the upper left, which opened to great fanfare in Libertyville in August of 1937. The freestanding theater building boasted a 750-seat capacity, air conditioning, and other modern amenities. Other notable buildings from this period include the Post Office building in the upper right, which is today's Civic Center Senior Center, which was constructed in 1935, and the Libertyville Masonic Temple, a striking Art Deco design in the lower left. A new central school building was built in 1939, it's shown here on the right, to replace the deteriorating 1880s building. The new building was partially funded by a federal Public Works Administration grant. The 1930s also saw the movement of national chain stores into Libertyville's central business district, and some of those chain stores opened within existing buildings along Milwaukee Avenue. Now, this is a 1950s view, but it does a good job of showing those different stores. You can see on the left with the red background and yellow font, F.W. Woolworths, which is among the most well-known 5 and dime stores in America. And it opened a branch in the Proctor building in the early 1930s. The store underwent a renovation and extension in 1940, and with 5,000 square feet of retail space, it became the largest shop in the village. You can also see on the right the A&P supermarket and the Miller Drugs. It's a little hard to read, but it says Walgreens Agency. While some chains went into existing buildings, others had specific buildings built. In 1931, a one-story building was erected at 515 North Milwaukee Avenue for the Consumer Sanitary and Coffee Company, a grocery chain later bought by Kroger. You can see it up here in the upper left as Keswick's in the 1950s, that is now Firkins. In 1940, the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known as the A&P, which had been in town for a couple of decades, moved into the new one-story commercial structure at 525 to 531 North Milwaukee Avenue. You can see the newspaper photo here. Langworthy's department store occupied the south half of the building, while the A&P was located in the north half. Eventually, Langworthy's would occupy the entire building. So we've covered the first 100 years of Libertyville, but I'd like to at least touch on the next 50 years or so, since the town experienced a lot of change in that time. The decades following the end of World War II were a time of unprecedented growth throughout the United States, eclipsing even the boom of the 1920s. This was especially true in suburban areas, helped by an ever-expanding and improving system of roads, including new interstate highways and increased availability of financing. Libertyville was not immune to this explosion of growth. The village population grew from about 4,000 residents in 1940 to 5,500 in 1950 and reached 8,500 by 1960, an increase of over 200% in just 2 decades. Articles in local newspapers from the late 1950s and early 1960s regularly listed an ever-growing list of speculative housing projects, some in existing subdivisions, others in new tracts set ever further from the village center. An industrial expansion also marked the post-war period in Libertyville, with a growing number of companies drawn to the area. We're looking at right now at the 1949 Village Directory, and it includes less than 20 firms in the industry category. But by the mid-1970s, in Chamber of Commerce brochures, the number had grown to over 50. One of those companies was the Frank G. Huff Company of Libertyville, located at the end of East Sunnyside Avenue. At the war's end, Huff made it its policy to hire only returning GIs and to pay them a nickel more than the going wage. With over 90% of the employees having served in the war, the state of Illinois acknowledged the company with an award for this outstanding practice. In addition to being a leading employer in Libertyville, Huff sponsored employee sports teams, clubs, and the Vocal Airs, a singing group that performed throughout the area. With all these new people working at Huff and other Libertyville companies, housing was needed. And here we are looking at an aerial photo of the Copeland Manor subdivision, looking to the northeast. For Copeland Manor, although it had been platted in the 1920s, over 100 homes were built in 1947, and 227 homes were scheduled to be built between 1948 and 1949. An article in the August 1st, 1957 edition of the Independent Register reported that over 1,100 new houses were slated for construction in Libertyville within the next year. And a subsequent article in 1963 outlined an additional 1,000 houses planned for construction that year. Some of the subdivisions during that time period on the north were Libertyville Estates, on the south, Valley Park and Concord Green, on the west, Paradise Lane, Blueberry Hill, and Victory Drive, and on the east, the Oaks. Once again, schools and other social institutions were needed to serve the growing population. Ground was broken for Highland Middle School in June 1949. You can see Highland in the upper left. Adlai Stevenson spoke at the dedication of the new Butler Lake building of Libertyville Fremont High School on November 7th, 1954. There's a picture of that building in the upper right. Copeland Manor Elementary School was opened in 1958 to accommodate students from the Copeland Manor subdivision in southeastern Illinois at the lower left. And the Adler Park Pool opened. Upon his death in 1949, architect David Adler's home and land on the north side of the town was given into the village. In 1951, a park opened with a pool and picnic grounds. The pool seen here was opened a few years later. And Adler Park Pool opened its doors in 1959 to serve the north side of Libertyville. Other institutional, educational, and religious buildings were also expanded or added on during the post-war period. Condell Memorial Hospital added the Noble Wing in 1952, and the Huff Maternity Wing was completed in 1954. St. Joseph's Catholic Church, seen here on the bottom, whose congregation had grown to over 1,000 families by 1960, extended its original 1920 school building on East Maple Avenue with a substantial addition in the 1950s. In 1966, the congregation replaced its 1905 church building, which could only accommodate 300 people, with the sprawling neo-expressionist sanctuary building that's still with us today. The Methodist Church also raised its 1913 building on Brainerd and Church in 1967 and built a larger modern sanctuary and educational building. And in 1968, the current Cook Memorial Public Library building was opened behind the Cook home. There were a few new buildings that appeared downtown in the 40s and 50s. The A&P moved from where we saw it earlier in that 1950s postcard to directly across from Cook Park. That was later Arden's Furniture and an Indian motorcycle dealership. It's now Brick and Mortar, a co-working location. The Petronics building in the upper right was built after a fire in 1954 destroyed the building that was there before. The building on the northeast corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Church Street in the lower left opened in 1956 with Julian's Men and Boys Wear and Jay's Shoes. And the 1950s also saw a retail expansion out of the immediate downtown area. The National Tea Company anchored the first Village Shopping Center. It's our first strip mall at the corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Park Avenue. That's now the little strip mall that has Improv Playhouse in it. It had Amphibosport. The St. Joseph's Food Pantry is also in that location. Memories of life in Libertyville during the 50s and 60s are likely to bring up these two items. After John Cuneo brought the holdings of Samuel Insull, he started a dairy farm. Hawthorne Melody Farms welcomed visitors beginning in the late 1940s. Educational tours brought children from social services agencies such as Chicago's Hull House. A state-of-the-art milking parlor, seen here in the upper left, with a viewing gallery opened in 1949, and it soon became a popular tourist attraction. Cuneo built on the success, and he opened a zoo, as well as a frontier town that had a miniature steam train. And many liberal residents still remember the day presidential candidate John F. Kennedy campaigned on the steps of the library in the fall of 1960. If you're interested in a video of that speech, it's not on the Liberal Historical Society's website, but if you go to YouTube and just Google JFK in Libertyville, there is a recording of him giving his speech outside of the house. As early as the late 1950s, concern was expressed among Liberals leaders about the long-term viability of the village's central business district, as shopping centers throughout the state began to drain revenue away from historic downtowns. Efforts were made in the late 1950s and 60s by the village to make the downtown more inviting to shoppers. Milwaukee Avenue was widened in 1960, and land was purchased within the district for additional parking lots. Also during this period, many business owners began to modernize the storefronts and facades of older buildings. Many historic facades were obscured with aluminum slip covers in order to make them more fashionable and appealing to potential shoppers. The Federal Savings Bank put a little bit of a cover on the front here. A more distinctive one was this covering of the bank building that is today the Real Trust, as well as the sort of Tudor style on the what is today's picnic basket building. Despite these changes, Liberal's historic downtown continued to lose ground in new shopping centers with their modern decor, spacious layouts, and ample parking. Although downtown Liberal was experiencing difficulties, residential development boomed during the 1970s. There were hundreds and hundreds of building permits were issued between 1974 and 1977. Subdivisions such as Red Top Farm, Lake Manure Estates, Cambridge North, Winchester Road, Stonegate, and Green Tree all sprung to life, spurred by the influx and growth of major industries in the area, such as Abbott Laboratories and Baxter. The establishment of Liberal's Main Street program in the late 1880s signaled the beginning of the downtown's renaissance. Through the unflagging efforts of residents, government officials, and business leaders, by the late 1990s, Libertyville's historic downtown core was once again the thriving center of the community. And today, Libertyville's downtown is a destination. It's a lively reference scene and shopping, and the town is excited to look to the future while celebrating and honoring its past. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will now put up the QR code I promised for and take questions. All right. Someone was reporting they went to Bush School on Bush Road, now Butterfield School. Yes, there are some pictures online of that. And then after it closed, says she went to Copeland for 4th grade. All right, are there any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. I've got the chat box up so I can see your questions as you enter them. All right, I'm not getting any questions. Could someone just type a hi or something so I can make sure the chat is actually working? Yeah, okay, thank you. Chat is working. Okay, super. Okay. All right. Well, if a question pops in your mind later, feel free to contact me either at the library or through the Historical Society. Happy to research any questions you might have if we don't already have the information. The Bush photos, there is one photo online through the Illinois Digital Archive. So from the Liberal Historical Society's collection, either on the Liberal Historical Society research page or on the local history page of the libraries, you'll see photos, documents, and postcards, and you'll see it there. I believe the library also has a blog post on schools. If you went to the library and where it says search the catalog and do the drop down and search the website and put in Bush School, I believe there's a blog post that Bush School is mentioned in. Sorry, that was a lot of different places to do that, to find it. All right, I see a Q&A. Could you clarify where the first train station was and what happened to it? The first train station was basically at the intersection of Cook Avenue and First Street. And the person with the Bush School, I'll put it in the chat. Hold on just a second. After the train station moved to the north of town, the station at Cook and First served as a freight station for a while. Off the top of my head, I don't remember when it was torn down. I could find that information, but I don't remember the exact date. For the photos that I was looking at, if you go to, probably the easiest way to do is go to cooklib.org/local history, and then look for, sorry, I'm typing and trying to talk at the same time. All right, so in the chat I just posted, if you go to the library's local history page, if you click on photos, postcards, and documents, that will take you to the Illinois Digital Archive, the Libertyville History Collection. There's about 3,900 items that have been scanned from the Historical Society's collection. I know that Bush School, both the old one and the new one, in quotes, are in there. Thank you for posting that schoolhouses link. That's the blog post I was thinking of. What was the name of the town at the time of the banner? It was Libertyville. It was not incorporated yet, though, so the township was also named Libertyville, but basically this area was referred to as Libertyville. Do you know which year that paste company closed complete? I think probably Pasta Company. You know, I was trying to figure that out the other day, the Folds Company. Someone else may know off the top of their head. It was in the late 20-teens. I don't know that it's been quite 10 years yet. Yes, thank you. I thought it was Pasta. Yeah, the Folds Company. I'm not sure if it's been 10 years yet, but it's definitely been more than 5, more than 6. Are there other churches, denominations, or religious groups that no longer exist? Well, there's no Universalist church in Libertyville. The Congregationalist, although basically what the Congregationalist turned into, it's the Ivanhoe Church. The original Congregational Church was established in Libertyville before moving out to Ivanhoe. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head besides the Universalists that were here and are not here anymore. What are they building by the tracks now where everything is torn down? Oh, behind the doll building, like at Lake, behind building by the train station. If that's okay, yeah. So there were 4 houses there. From the village's website, they have a major construction website. It's going to be, I believe, an apartment or a condominium building. All right. Okay, let's see, what is the oldest building still standing in Libertyville? That is a good question. Well, commercial buildings, there's only 4 commercial buildings that are older than the Great Fire. The Picnic Basket, the American Legion building, and the 2 buildings that are next to each other that house the Tavern and Allure Beauty. So those are all pre-1895. And there are houses in town that are older than that. In fact, one of the houses directly across the street from Cook Park, which is now the lawyer's office, is one of the older houses in town. And the mall by the tracks is torn down too, right by the track. That was all owned by the same family, that kind of L-shaped property. My understanding of what I've seen online through the village and through newspaper articles is that is phase 2. They're using it to stage the construction of the other apartment building. I don't know what the plans are for where that mall was torn down. What are the differences in dates of 1836 and 1872 for establishment of Libertyville? I'll go back to that one. Oldest house is Copeland's east of the river on Old Rockland Road. Maybe. I've done some research on that house, and you definitely see it on the 1885 map. I can't remember if you see it on the 1860 plat map. If the people who own it have more information on that, I'd be happy to take a look at it and add it to our files. So different dates are used for the establishment. It depends on what you consider establishment. So, I mean, the first resident was here in 1835. The story about the flagpole is 1836. There isn't an 1872 date. 1882 is the incorporation of the village. So it just depends on what you call establishment. All right. Is there a story why they chose the patriotic names Independence Grove and then Libertyville? I don't know exactly. That's not really part of the story, although that July 4th, 1836 was the, what, 50th? It was definitely on Independence Day. I'm not doing my math correctly. 60th. That's all I know. They chose the name on July 4th according to the story. There is a story about Independence Grove not being able to be a post office, and then Libertyville was chosen. But other than that, I don't know particularly why they chose those names, other than to be patriotic. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm gonna wrap up for this evening. Again, if questions occur to you afterward, please do contact me. And if any of you asked questions and you don't feel I gave a satisfactory answer, please give me a ring or give me an email, and I'd be happy to pull the documents and look at it a little closer and or send you those documents as well. And we also want to hear, I mean, if I said something tonight that you just think is completely wrong, let me know. I mean, we use what sources we have available, but if you have documentation that shows something else, always happy to look at different information and see if we can figure out which of it is the most likely. So again, thank you very much. I will be sending the recording in the next couple of days. I appreciate all of you joining today. And I hope to see you at the Cook Home. Please do the Stars and Parks adventure. And keep an eye out for our Fall History Matters lineup that'll be coming out in August. So again, thank you very much, and we'll see you the next time around. Good night.